World War II, like World War I, but bigger. So big in fact that almost every major country in the world is going to take a long time to recover, except for the United States of America, who entered the post-war period as the most powerful country in the world and ready to change it. My name is Anish and this is part 3 of my videos on the USA's 20th century, which is going to cover US history from the start of the Cold War to the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. Okay, so the USA enters the Second World War in a very strong position and want to scrap the whole isolationism thing and ramp up their influence in the world. If I were to do a video on all the countries the US has meddled in, this could take a very long time. So I'm just going to cover the important ones. First up is Europe, which has just been torn to shreds, and when you get suffering, people are much more likely to turn to revolution and communism. America also didn't want to return to the economic depression of the 1930s, so they needed to sustain European markets for trading and economic purposes. To prevent communism from spreading elsewhere, especially in Western Europe, America put forward the Marshall Plan, which gave Europe billions of American dollars to fix their economies on the condition that they open up their markets to American trade. 2 birds, 1 stone. The Soviets blocked Eastern Europe from receiving Marshall aid, and this marked the first real breakup of Europe between a communist Eastern Europe and a capitalist West. In a matter of years, the wartime Grand Alliance between the USA, Britain and the Soviet Union had completely disintegrated into 2 hostile blocs, with the USA championing global capitalism and the Soviet Union championing global communism. Franklin Delano Roosevelt died in office in 1945, and then we got President Truman, and he definitely sees the world in black and white. The Americans are the good guys, and the Soviets, the communists, are the bad guys. He announces the Truman Doctrine in 1948, which states that the USA will militarily and economically support countries resisting communism, and many consider this as the informal declaration of the Cold War. The Truman administration also tried to adopt a foreign policy called containment, which was designed to prevent the further expansion of communism without actually going to war. Well, it didn't do a great job because in the next few years, China would fall to communism and then North Korea, and it felt like America was losing the Cold War. Then in 1950, the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung, with Soviet and Chinese backing, decided to launch an invasion of South Korea. This brought back like PTSD of German and Japanese expansion in the 1930s, and if the US had learned anything from the whole Hitler fiasco, is that appeasement and non-intervention does not work. The US and their allies decided to take a stance against North Korea, and from this area called Busan, UN forces managed to push the North Koreans all the way back to here. Then China got involved and they got pushed back to this line, which is the border to this day. South Korea was saved, but this was an absolutely horrific war, which cost millions of lives. The Korean War really stirred up a lot of mass hysteria and paranoia back home about the C words, communism. People thought this went right to the top, and a senator called Joseph McCarthy claimed to have identified 206 communists that had infiltrated the US government and were working in the State Department. This paranoia of McCarthyism was fueled by some high-profile court cases such as Soviet spies in Hollywood and in the atomic program. And then when the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite into space in 1957, Americans acted like it was the end of the world. But McCarthy would soon go after the US Army and even the president, at which point people started to realise that he was a bit of a nutter. But whilst America abroad was preaching freedom and liberalism, at home minorities such as African Americans had completely separate education, legal and political systems and faced a lot of discrimination in everyday life. In 1955, an African American lady called Rosa Parks said that she didn't want to sit on the back of the bus, and this absolute power move kickstarted the Civil Rights Movement, which sought full political, social and economic rights for African Americans. A lot of different strategies were used, such as civil disobedience in the Montgomery bus boycott, legal action in Brown vs. Board of Education, and later on black militancy taught by Malcolm X. But it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s message of love and non-violence that won the hearts of the nation. Then in 1963, 100 years since Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery, over 250,000 people marched in Washington, and Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and eventually the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were signed into legislation. The civil rights movement started to die down towards the end of the 1960s with a bit of unfinished business. Then in Cuba, things got very heated. For basic context, the Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro launched a coup in Cuba and took power in 1959. The USA controlled the majority of Cuban industry, so when Castro started nationalizing land in Cuba, this really rubbed America the wrong way. So the US military had an absolutely brilliant plan. It would train up these Cuban exiles, who in turn would launch an invasion of Cuba and try to start a revolution and get rid of Castro. The CIA tried to make it seem like the US wasn't involved and that it was purely these exiles. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, and the Bay of Pigs invasion was an absolute failure, and everyone could tell who was really behind this. Castro then became very close with the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and turned towards the Soviet bloc, who would absolutely love to have a friendly communist ally right next to the USA. So the Soviets planned to give Castro some nuclear weapons, and when Kennedy found out about this, there was a whole naval blockade standoff, and things got unbelievably tense, and we were so close to nuclear war in 1962. Eventually, Kennedy and Khrushchev agreed to back down, and the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and the USA would secretly remove theirs from Turkey. The world could take one big sigh of relief, with Kennedy treated as a hero, and Khrushchev, well, not so much. But in 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and this sent shockwaves around the world, because he was like international royalty. In comes Lyndon Baines Johnson, and he immediately starts strong by passing some of the most comprehensive civil rights legislation in US history, with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But unfortunately, LBJ is also remembered for his role in the Vietnam War. So the country of Vietnam just couldn't catch a break and had been in a state of war pretty much since the end of World War II. At first, it started as an anti-colonial war against the French, and then it turned into a conflict between the communist North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the anti-communist South Vietnam, led by Nguyen Dinh Diem. Both looked like sweet old Asian men, but both were ruthless dictators. Of course, the USA wants to stick it to communism wherever it can, so it starts backing South Vietnam, and President Johnson really makes some decisions to escalate this war. By 1967, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, many of which were just ordinary American citizens that were drafted into military service. But the real issue was, they weren't winning this war, which is something that America was not used to. Stories about the atrocities occurring in Vietnam came back home, and the television set brought the realities of war straight to the American households. And the USA starts to ask itself, are we the bad guys? Anti-war sentiment grew, and so much money was getting pumped into this war, which started to cause an economic crisis back home. When the USA eventually pulled out in 1973, South Vietnam was overrun by the North within only 2 years, and Laos and Cambodia also fell to communism, and it seemed like the war was all for nothing. Vietnam dominated US foreign policy for nearly a decade, and at the end of it, the USA came out in a much weaker position. The war divided a nation, the USA's allies failed to support them, and America really starts to question their own position on foreign intervention. And on that note, I'm going to end the video here. The next one is going to cover the Nixon era, Ronald Reagan, and the end of the Cold War. See you then.